Welcome to the Quack and Road podcast. My name is Quack Hui Lan. If you ever wonder what spirituality has to do with liberation, you'll find out more from our guest, Professor Christopher Tirres, who teaches religious studies at Santa Clara University. Chris, can you share with us why did you write the recent book, which is Liberating Spiritualities, Reimagining Faith in the Americas?
I decided to write this book maybe for three reasons. Number one, I wanted to continue an investigation of theological and religious thought in light of two traditions, so liberation theology and U.S. pragmatism. My first book, written in 2014, was called The Aesthetics and Ethics of Faith, a dialogue between liberationist and pragmatic thought. And I wanted to continue to explore this fertile intersection between liberation theology and philosophical pragmatism. So that's the first reason. Secondly, I wanted to create a work that brought together thinkers both in North America and in South America. There's a fertile conversation, a trans-hemispheric discourse that has happened now for decades between thinkers in both of these parts of the globe. And I wanted to show the commonalities, the ways of thinking, the common methods utilized between thinkers in the North and thinkers in the South. And finally, and this has become even more important after the election of November 2024, is that I wanted to provide a resource for folks of goodwill to see that there are resources within the Christian tradition and outside of it that can speak to spirituality in a way that's liberating, especially now that we're dealing so much with the vitriol of white Christian nationalism. I wanted to remind folks that there are resources, philosophical, theological resources that we can draw on in order to address and hopefully respond to the threats of white Christian nationalism.
Chris, I know that you have a beautiful cover for your book. Can you explain the meaning of the cover?
I'm very proud of this cover. The cover is from a visual artist by the name of Juan Sanchez. He's a Nuyorican visual artist who lives in New York City. And when I saw this, I thought this is the perfect image for my cover. I like it for a number of reasons. First of all, you'll notice from the top half of the cover that we have some feet with flip-flops, sandals. These are actually Juan Sanchez's mother's feet. She grew up very poor in Puerto Rico. And right below the feet, you see a tribute. This is a poem, a handwritten poem that is written in honor of his mother. And the poem, very interestingly, switches between past and present tense. So this is a tribute to his mother. On the top half, we see suffering and hardship. And on the bottom half, we see these vibrant colors coming through that connote life, that connote hope, that connote joy. And really, the book is about both of these aspects. It's both about suffering, but it's also about hope. It's also about new life. It's also about joy. So we have this kind of dialectic at play in the book. The other thing that's very interesting for me is that we have these markers of religion or faith or spirituality within this heart-shaped figure here. In the middle here, we have a prayer card to Our Lady of Perpetual Help. This is the prayer card that Juan Sanchez's mother used, that she prayed to every night before she went to bed. So again, it's kind of speaks to his own context and his own life. And right under the prayer card, we have 5 cowrie shells, which point in the direction of African Caribbean spirituality. So we have this element of kind of formal religion in the prayer card to Our Lady of Perpetual Help, but then we also have these elements of lived religion or popular religion right under that. As I've thought more about the cover, what's really interesting to me is that we also have some colors outside of the perimeter of this heart-shaped figure. We see some colors outside of the heart that are shading off into the more monochromatic colors of the black and the blue. I think what I'm really trying to get at here is, could this be spirituality outside of the frame of institutional or even popular forms of religion? And I wanted to explore in the book how spirituality can also be thought of as in terms of our everyday habits and actions, as part of the way that we live our everyday life, our quotidian life, or what Ada Maria Isasi Diaz calls lo cotidiano, our everyday expressions of engaging with the world. At root, the book is about spirituality, but not spirituality simply in a conventional sense, because conventionally spirituality refers to particular religious traditions. I want to honor that aspect, but I also want to think about spirituality as it emerges outside of or even connected to those more formal aspects in terms of everyday habits and actions. And that's really pragmatism and liberation theology infusing the work.
Chris, you have always paid attention to the use of symbols, aesthetics, colors in popular spirituality. Can you explain to us why?
A big part of that for me has to do with the way that we understand experience in the richest and most robust way. As I see it, philosophical pragmatism and liberation theology are both inquiries into experience, into particular context, into particular historical situations. And in order to look at experience, which is also the work of any good empirical theology or any good empiricism, for centuries, the tendency has been to think about empirical inquiry only in terms of that which can be measured, that which can be quantified. But what the pragmatist tradition does and what liberation theology does, particularly the offshoots of liberation, I'm thinking of here Latino, Hispanic, US Latino theology. I'm thinking here of Black theology. I'm thinking here of Asian American theology. What it does is it also invites us into, again, the everyday aspects of our life. And the question there becomes, how do we take stock of those aspects of reality, those aspects of experience, which may be not all that easy to directly quantify or measure, but which shape people's lives and which gives them hope and which helps to lead them in certain paths. And when we ask the question that way, we begin to move into the realm of aesthetics, which is also part of human experience, which is also part of the way that we see and sense and feel. So for me, the work of John Dewey, especially in graduate school, was pivotal in terms of opening up this idea of aesthetics to everyday life and the way that we transact with experience in ways that are aesthetic and sensory and felt. That provided an initial lens for me to think about experience in a more robust way, outside of simple measurements, but also asking these questions of feeling and sensing and tasting and so forth. And so from the very beginning, that's always been an important part of my inquiry. Now, as I was studying pragmatism, I was also getting more into the study of US Latino theology. And again, the category that Ada Maria Isasi Diaz uses, the category that Maria Pilar Aquino and so many other very important US Latina feminist theologians have really leaned on, is this category of lo cotidiano, what happens in our everyday experience. And for me, this is fundamentally an aesthetic category. It's not only an aesthetic category because it also asks questions about how are we critically engaging our everyday experience? How are we using our wisdom? How are we using our intelligence? How are we using forms of concientización, to quote Paulo Freire? So that's part of it, the rational cognitive dimension of how we interact with everyday experience. But the other part is, again, how we sense, how we feel, how we taste everyday experience, and really trying to honor that. So for me, it was a natural marriage between philosophical pragmatism and these liberation theologies that were emerging within the context of the Americas. In short, it gives us, I think, the attention to aesthetics gives us a fuller picture of what experience and reality is all about.
Can you share with us who are the figures you study in this book, Liberating Spiritualities?
Sure, I would be happy to share a little bit about the figures. You see them up here on the screen, and I guess if you're listening to the podcast, I'll go through their names very quickly here. José Carlos Mariátegui is a Peruvian Marxist born in 1894. Moving chronologically, we have the brilliant Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, born in 1921, followed by Virgilio Elizondo, the Mexican-American contextual theologian and the father of U.S. Latino theology, born in 1935 in San Antonio, Texas. His contemporary is the fourth figure, Gloria Anzaldúa, born also in South Texas in the year 1942. And then we have Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, born a year later in 1943. And then, of course, Brazilian ecofeminist theologian Ivona Guevara, born in 1944. So all of these folks are early 20th century thinkers. We don't have time to go into each of them, but I would like to just maybe say three things about why I chose these figures. So for me, it was important to narrow the study, and I decided that I wanted to narrow it to the 20th century. In earlier iterations of the book, I was thinking about other people like Bartolomé de las Casas or Montesinos or Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who have been important figures who have anticipated this discourse around liberation theology. But because we live in the 20th century and because questions of intersectionality were so important to me and interculturality, I decided to focus on the 20th century. I also wanted to focus on six figures that maybe haven't gotten the kind of recognition and the kind of study that some other classical liberationist thinkers have received, such as Gustavo Gutierrez or perhaps Leonardo Boff or Ignacio Ellacuría. There's some wonderful work on all of these figures, but I really wanted to look at maybe some slightly understudied figures within this larger framework of liberationist thought. And so I settled on these six figures. It was also important to me that I had an even breakdown of figures from North America and South America. So we have three from the North and three from the South. I wanted to get three men and three women to kind of balance things off in that way. And then I also wanted to make sure that I had theologians, but I also had non-theologians, that I had some theists, and I also had non-theists. And that's why in the book, I think the presence of José Carlos Mariátegui and Gloria Anzaldúa add another dimension to this kind of work, because they are not theologians, they are not theists, they long left the Catholic Church, but they have always retained this interest, this passion for what can be called activist forms of spirituality, activist forms of faith. And that's still imprinted on their thought. And what I do in those chapters is I look at that and I really try to excavate those themes that come out in their work. And part of the rationale here is to show that theology doesn't have a stronghold on these questions of spirituality, that you can have committed humanists who are also coming to this question and also have a lot to offer. So I wanted to create, again, a dialogue between the theologians and the non-theologians. And I think that this particular mix was a nice way to do that. And again, all of them address questions of interculturality, of intersectionality, and they're all addressing this larger question of the logics of colonial Christendom.
These philosophers and theologians and secular writers, they have all criticized colonial Christianity. Do you think that their work will have particular relevance for United States today?
I hope so. And I hope that folks who read the book can see their relevance. I think there's three features that connect them all. And I addressed this in the introduction: the critique of colonial Christianity. Number two, they all see spirituality as a pervasive quality of all human life, of all human existence. It's a quality of our shared existence. And it's also a tool for social transformation. That's a third element here. But to the first element, I frame it in terms of a critique of colonial Christianity. The critique of colonial Christianity today in 2025 takes the shape of the critique of white Christian nationalism. And white Christian nationalism is very much an offshoot of colonial Christendom, insofar that you have these logics of empire, that you have these dualisms that are created between the holy other God and everything else in existence, where God has absolute power and reign over the natural world, which includes humans. And this, of course, leads to a distorted kind of logic by which people then begin to create their own forms of dualisms and hierarchies, straight over gay, man over woman. And the list runs long here. I think if these folks were still alive today, and Ivona Guevara still is alive today, but certainly if the others would be alive today, I think that they would be speaking quite loudly about the ills and about the damage that white colonial Christianity, white national Christianity, nationalistic Christianity is doing to our society.
What would you say about the spirituality of resilience in this time of wars, chaos, and uncertainty?
I think that there need to be multiple answers or responses to that question in terms of thinking about what makes up a liberating spirituality. How can we think about a spirituality of resistance? And I just want to center these last comments here around 5 key points. Number 1, I would encourage folks of goodwill to lean into spiritual practices. And that will look different for different people. For some, it's going to be really leaning into a church home, a faith community, whether that's going to church, going to prayer groups, praying daily, reflecting on scripture, so on and so forth. For others, spiritual practice may be forms of meditation. It may be staying physically active, such as yoga or going on walks, enjoying nature. And this really goes along with the theme of the book, which is that we need to really think about spirituality in a very encompassing way. That is, to think about it both as a quality of human experience, on top of which are layered other elements of human experience. That could be the political aspect of our being, the sexual aspect of our being, the physical aspect of our being. So all of these things can exist on top of each other and at one time. But I think it is important that we key in to that spiritual yearning part of us and feed that in whatever ways we can. So that would be my first answer, to really lean into it. And also to think about spirituality as a function of human intelligence. This is another key part of the book. We have this amazing capacity, which is the human mind, to work through problems and to make sense of things and to make meaning out of things. And so the book is also an invitation just to shift our angle of vision slightly, to see that form of intelligence as a kind of spiritual act. So to really understand this close connection between spirituality and what I would call embodied intelligence. It's not simply what happens up here, but the way in which our intelligence informs what we do with our bodies, informs what we do in space and time, in history. That's what I mean by embodied intelligence. And I think that the philosophical pragmatism and liberation theology are both very good on this count. And I do want to mention as well that we can also think about indigenous traditions also leaning into these kinds of practices. So I don't want to suggest that philosophical pragmatism and liberation theology hold the key, because there are many kinds of cultural expressions that would fit this kind of idea of leaning into a spiritual practice. And so we can look to our indigenous brothers and sisters and ask, how are they leaning into their lives in these dark times? The second suggestion would be to find your communities and lean into those. We are all relational creatures. And as I said before, I think pragmatism and liberation theology and other indigenous cosmologies, they understand this. We live in a relational world that is always in motion, that is always in process. So to understand ourselves within this larger web, this larger matrix of existence is crucial, because it's so easy to be isolated, to have a privatized faith, but to realize that we actually gain sustenance from those who came before us. And we have a responsibility to pass on cherished values, cherished ideals to those who come after us. So to imagine ourselves within this wider matrix of human beings and nature. So to really open up this idea of community, I think, is number 2. The third suggestion would be to take the long view. The day after the presidential election of November 2024, I had a terrible pit in my stomach, and I knew that it was going to be a long haul. And I looked at myself in the mirror after getting up, and I told myself, what if African Americans and if indigenous folks could have dealt with the kind of hatred and animosity that they've had to deal with for centuries, then certainly I could shore up, I can lift myself up a little bit, make sure that I have a strong back, and I can move forward. And so it was helpful for me to think about those communities. And also, of course, I thought about Latino communities, Asian American communities in the context of the Americas and all the struggles that they've gone through. But the first communities that I went to were indigenous folks as well as African American folks, because they know what it is to struggle, and we can learn from that struggle. And I think those kinds of struggles can give us hope. They can give us resilience as we move forward. So it's really important to take the long view. I will say one other thing on taking the long view, and that is that in the chapter on Virgilio Elizondo, one of the things that I argue in that chapter is to say that Elizondo was very indebted to the work of the scientist and paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin. And not many people know about this, but I really wanted to uncover this aspect of his thought, because not only does it align Elizondo in kind of a process or pragmatic trajectory, but it also reminds us just how much he learned from Teilhard de Chardin. And of course, we know that Teilhard de Chardin had a very long view. Teilhard de Chardin was not only thinking in terms of years or decades or even century, he was thinking in terms of millennia, in terms of human evolution across millennia. And I think when we locate ourselves within this broader spectrum of thousands and millions and perhaps even longer frameworks of time, then it helps to put things in perspective and to realize that we're part of this larger universe story. And yes, there are things that we can certainly do in our lifetime to make sure that we are affecting change as needed, but also to realize that there's a larger trajectory that's larger than us, and we're part of this evolutionary flow. So it was helpful for me to take the long view, and I think it might be helpful for others. Number 4 would be to intervene when and where you can. Intervene when and where you can. And we can all intervene, whether we're teachers, whether we're students, whether we're members of the community, or members of faith communities or not. There are things that we can do in our daily lives, in our daily networks, that will invite us to have the courage to take a stand. And we will know when those times come. And it's so important that when those times come, we have the fortitude, we have the wherewithal, and we have the courage to say, I need to intervene in this way, and I can do my small part on this question. So a lot of it is having the courage to take that stand when the time comes, and we will all have those opportunities. And last but not least, I would say, a way to cultivate a kind of liberating spirituality or spirituality of resistance is to savor life, is to realize that we are part of this bigger matrix of life, and that life is a gift. We all got up this morning. We were able to open our eyes. We were able to get out of bed. We were able to get on with our day, brush our teeth, have our breakfast, and get on with the world. And even though the larger framework of things can look so dismal, so abysmal these days, the fact is we are still in the fight, and we still have the capability to redirect ourselves in ways that can lead to forms of healing and leads to forms of transformation. And a lot of that is just recognizing that we have the opportunity, we have the ability, we have the intelligence, we have the courage to do. And so just to recognize that and to really treat that as a gift. And one of the things that I've enjoyed about teaching so much at a Jesuit university like Santa Clara University is that we talk a lot about God in all things. And of course, God is a very large symbol, and we can understand this symbol in many ways. To recognize that this sense of the divine, this sense of the ultimate, is part and parcel of our everyday existence, whether we call it God, whether we call it justice, whether we call it goodness. The point is that we are part of this beautiful and mysterious matrix that provides the grounds for us to flourish. And then, of course, the next question is, are we going to have the courage? Are we going to have the intelligence? Are we going to have the wherewithal to take up that challenge? And that's up to us. And that's when we need to start to participate in this larger universe story. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much for joining the podcast today. If you like this episode, please click like and subscribe. I see you in the next episode.